Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joining us today for the fourth in the Ed Talk series. We're delighted today to have Alan Greenberg, a venture partner from EDT Partners, with us. Alan's got a wealth of experience, which I'm sure he'll explain in more detail, and really looking forward to hearing from him shortly. Just a quick bit of housekeeping. Please mute yourself when now we've started the webinar. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat section of the webinar, and we'll go through those at the end. So we'll hand over to Alan shortly, and we'll take it from there. So I will stop sharing. Joe, it's over to you. Then Alan can begin.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar and the opportunity to talk with you and your colleagues. Joe, are my slides there, or I'm not seeing them at this point in time?
Sorry, I'm just going onto the other screen. I'm just having a little bit of problem with them.
It's okay. I mean, just by way of background, before I go into what I want, it's there. So let me start from this point. I mean, I've been in the education sector now some 14, 15 years. Previously, I was education director at Apple from 2004 to 2009. My team at Apple built podcasting, iTunes U, where the universities publish it into the the education portal, helped build the first generation of the App Store and the first generation of education apps, initially director across Europe, then depending who you ask, either promoted or excommunicated, and spent a couple of years in China, having caused so much chaos in Europe. They thought it'd be a good idea to drop me on the Chinese. Really insightful working across Asia Pac after working across Europe. Returned to the UK at the end of 2009, started working with hedge funds, VCs, angel investors, family offices, looking predominantly at education, health tech investment. And I now have a portfolio of businesses, and I work with EDT and Partners as a venture partner. When David and I were talking the other day, we were talking about, some of the subjects that are relevant in this hopefully post-COVID environment. And I would argue that everything is the same and everything is different. And what I mean by that is, and if you go to the next slide, Joe, is that we live in a time of distributed networks. If you think about the challenges that parents have had with homeschooling, if you think about the challenges universities and colleges have with the fact that students were not able to return to the campus for anywhere up to a couple of years, and even though they're returning to the campus now, a lot more is done remotely and done in a digital environment than it was previously. And then if you also think about enterprise being a distributed network where many of us are not as yet and possibly never returning to the office quite the same way that we did previously. If you take PricewaterhouseCoopers, for example, they announced in January last year, not even January this year, that of their 22,000 employees in the United Kingdom, only 6,000 of them would have a desk. So you've got a huge proportion of people working in these distributed networks. And the challenge, I think, is the fact that if you think about education technologies, and I'm very happy to be challenged on this point, but if you think about education technologies generally, they are almost exclusively built for institutions. They're not necessarily built for the individual. So they're not built for a school to share their resources with parents. They're not built for, in real terms, for university students, many of whom now are paying for their education, to actually have the resources in the way that is necessary for them to have a rich digital environment, a remote environment. These digital environments were add-ons rather than structures that were built for the cause. And I would argue that in the world we live in today, in a post-COVID environment, we're moving to a B2B2C engagement piece where the consumer, the student, the end user is a critical point of this engagement, not just a added value set of circumstances. Next slide, please. So what that does, it changes the whole paradigm of how we deal with education. We are moving with the advent of AI, with adaptive learning, with the ability to drive data-driven resources, with cloud capability. We're moving into something which is a personal learning journey, a personal learning engagement with education rather than the traditional classroom. I mean, I would argue that, any teacher who walks into a classroom and is engaging 30 students, the best he or she can hope for is engaging with 30 kids who are average in the class. They're going to be challenged by 5 at the bottom of the class who are below average and need to be identified and supported in their learning journey to get back to average. And they're equally challenged by 5 at the top of the class who possibly need to be accelerating their learning and being brought back to the average. So the ability to personalize the learning journey, the ability to drive personal learning outcomes is becoming a critical part of the engagement model. I would also argue, where does learning happen? In my opinion, based on my experience, learning doesn't happen in the classroom. Learning happens everywhere else, 24/7, 365, wherever, on whatever device. So there are new paradigms, and COVID and the consequences of COVID are suggesting to me that these challenges and these opportunities need to be addressed today in a much more efficient way than they have been previously. Then you come across the data imperative, is that we're driving data across these platforms, we're driving data across these engagements, data to inform parents on how well their child is doing in real time, data to support the teacher in bringing the right resources to the classroom and to these digital engagements. And then that leads on to questions about digital identity. I mean, I, as one, do not particularly trust Google. I mean, Google, in my opinion, is an advertising platform. It's driven by search engine optimization. It's driven by driving whoever wants to pay the most to drive their content to the top of the engagement model. So authentic content, trusted distribution channels, and the ability for the data to be owned by the individual, and by that I mean the student or the parent of the student, rather than necessarily the institution or by default the technology company, I think is a new paradigm and a particularly important paradigm in this post-COVID environment. Hence the digital identity, hence the digital wallet, in my opinion, built on blockchain. Next slide, please. Then you've got priorities, and there are different priorities today, and the priorities are being driven again by this post-COVID environment or by these distributed networks. I mean, academic rigor will always be key. I mean, we are still judged and evaluated and assessed on the exams we pass or the tests we pass. So there's no question that the academic rigor is key, and having content which is fit for purpose, which deals with the pedagogy, which engages suitably with the subject matter and provides resources for students will always be the key component. But there's other issues which have arisen, other issues which are challenged by this distributed network, by homeschooling, by remote education. And in my opinion, the subject matter of social and emotional learning, of skills, of preparing young people for the workforce or preparing young people for society they're going to engage with, I think this is becoming an increasingly important component of the education mix. I mean, I'm of a generation where pastoral care was a key component in the education system. I would argue today in schools generally, the amount of effort and support that's given for pastoral care is less of an essential ingredient than it has been previously. And by default, the well-being of the individual student, their mental health is suffering. Then you have the relevance argument, which comes back to this personal learning journey. How do we drive relevance to support the individual in their own personal challenge, the ability to drive adaptive learning, to identify the individual needs? And ultimately, there's another piece which I think is critical, which is what I refer to as the impact audit. I mean, there's a very interesting book written by Sir Ronald Cohen called Impact, which I recommend to everyone. And he talks in detail there about the world in the 1930s when the American financial crash or the world financial crash happened in the 1930s. Prior to that, there was no auditing of companies. Today, 90 years later, we wouldn't do business with a company that didn't have P&L, financial, fiduciary responsibilities and auditing. We judge companies on their audit. But it's really interesting that it's taken 90 years to get that into place to be part of the ecosystem. But do we actually audit our education resources? Do we audit the impact we're having in the education space? Do we actually run any real analysis that can demonstrate what is useful and what is less useful? I could give examples of things that don't work, but probably naming names would not be particularly appropriate at this point in time. But I would argue that the impact audit is another major consequence of the post-COVID environment we live in, and to do with the data, ESG, sustainability within the education ecosystem. Next slide, please, Joan. So conclusions and questions. I mean, I would be pleased to be challenged on these subject matters. The world is moving to a B2B2C model. I repeat again, most technology companies are built for institutions. Institutions then have a responsibility for engaging the cohort within their organizations, whether it's the classroom or whether it's the university lecture hall or whether it's the college. And I'm not convinced that technology systems are actually built B2B2C. There's many technology companies that will tell you that they improvised over COVID. They provided this B2B2C solutions, but I doubt quite seriously whether the technologies were built for the consumer. I still think they were built for institutions. Personalization. I mean, the paradigm shift. I mean, I have, the privilege, or I have the advantage of having two children who had the advantage of private education. Both of them went on to Oxbridge. Both of them have succeeded in their education. But what they had the privilege in their education was to have that personal one-to-one engagement at Oxford and Cambridge with a tutor, the ability to have a conversation with a teacher and a tutor, a conversation with a domain expert, with a specialist. And there's no reason today in a digital environment where we can't drive this personalization, where we can actually identify the challenges of the individual student and support them in their individual learning journey. My kids, very bright, Oxford, Cambridge graduates, their father, unfortunately, less capable. My learning journey is convoluted. It takes me 6 times longer. I need to read things 6 times in order to understand what they understand first time around. It doesn't mean that I can't get to the same intellectual level and engagement as my children. It just means my journey is different. We need to recognize these personal learning journeys and personal learning outcomes. We live in a world where data and quantifiable impact is now becoming a key component. It's not just a case of anecdotally providing resources into the ecosystem, into this immersive environment, and we have Meta coming on board now, but we need to drive data, drive quantifiable impact, understand where successes are, learn from those lessons, share that data, and share that data holistically with the people who are responsible, the teachers, parents, organizations, and ultimately provide that data to the student themselves for them to be able to fulfill their potential as they move through education and move into workforce. At that point in time, I hope I've provoked some conversation from our audience, David. I'm going to ask, are there any questions out there? Anybody want to challenge me on some of the points that I've made?
Thank you very much, Alan. I've had one question come in, which was, how has COVID changed the way in which we view or approach education, particularly in remote areas?
It's a good point. I mean, the cities and remote areas, I mean, we don't necessarily all have the same access to education resources. I mean, there are challenges in society with keeping libraries open. I mean, in my day, a library was one of the mainstays of society. There are libraries closing now. So where do you go for your library? Surely there's a digital engagement there. So libraries would be a good example of how things are transitioning from, let's say, the legacy environments that we all are, or many of us are used to, into those new environments. There are many examples within the UK where remote parts of the United Kingdom, I mean, particularly there are articles that I've read referring to Cornwall, Devon, some of those areas. Also in the eastern parts of the UK, when you go out to Norwich and some of these areas where the infrastructure and resources for schools are very, very different than it would be within central London or central Birmingham or central Manchester. So I think there are challenges everywhere, and these challenges are not particularly new challenges, but to come to the point or come to the question, I think COVID is a paradigm shift. I mean, I don't want to be in any way disingenuous to people who suffered their health through COVID. That's something to be taken very seriously indeed. But I think it is a tipping point. I think it has changed things radically, where schools, colleges, universities, enterprise generally are prepared to look at things in a different way, are prepared to look at different models of engaging. We can accelerate our opportunity in terms of bringing digital engagement into place. But I want to make sure, and I want to be certain that what we're bringing into place is actually better than what we had previously. And I'm not convinced what we had previously was as efficient, as capable, as data-driven, as quantifiable, as impact audited as it needed to be. So those are my challenges in society, and I'm privileged to work with young companies and innovative organizations who are addressing these challenges and trying to drive that change and that new mindset into play.
Yep, thank you, Alan. I can definitely attest to the issues around connectivity living in the east of England in Norfolk. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that one. One of the questions that's come in is that you mentioned that education occurs outside the classroom, but how are we able to capture, recognise and reward that learning, which is often competency based? Big question.
Well, it's a very good point, and it brings up a whole subject area in itself. I mean, assessment itself is one of the biggest challenges in the education sector. It is rigid by nature. It is something that is measured at a specific point in time. But in my playbook, it's slightly different. I mean, let me give you two or three examples here. First of all, when we talk about education, we tend to segment it into kindergarten, primary, secondary, university, college, enterprise. There is one consistent that goes all the way through that. That's you, the individual. We all travel through either all or elements of modules of that education system, but we are the consistent element in that environment. So surely we should have, like we have our own wallet or purse, we should have our digital wallet that we take with us. In that digital wallet, it's not only showing what our accreditations are and our assessment pieces are, but it's also showing our skill set, our mindset. It's able to build a profile that when it comes to hopefully gainful employment or positioning ourselves in the workforce, we can bring more than a certificate that says we passed an exam and we got an A, B, or C pass. We can actually show people our aptitude, capability, ability to learn, our empathy with the workplace and opportunity. So I think that's one piece of the jigsaw. The second piece of the jigsaw is to do with what I would call lateral assessment. And if I can give an example of that, if you go to a doctor today, and particularly, I mean, I'll give you a specific subject area. If you were talking about stem cells and stem cell opportunities, and you talk to a doctor, then you're challenged because no doctor or most doctors in the world were not educated in stem cells and stem cells opportunity because that was not taught in the medical schools when they went through the medical schools or universities. So lifelong learning, CPD, continuous professional development, is key in the medical world. And then you start looking at lateral assessment because no doctor knows zero about a subject. Equally, no doctor knows 100% about a subject, but they will be in a spectrum that if you take the stem cell example, they might know 30% of the competency they need to make a judgment. So they need to be able to accelerate their learning. They need to be able to look into the resources they need to accelerate their learning to a level where they move from, for argument's sake, 30% to 55%, where they would be in a better position to make a decision on how stem cells could or could not be relevant to the patient that has come for that diagnostics. Equally, they may not revisit the same set of circumstances or the same modules of interest for a year or 2 years following this first interaction. So from a lateral assessment point of view, they may not maintain themselves at 55% of assessment. They may drop down to 45 or 50%. And if you could pick up and understand at a point in time where they are in that lateral assessment, and then from an adaptive point of view, accelerate their learning in order to achieve whatever they need to achieve to make the next diagnostics, that is what lateral assessment is all about, is understanding where the individual is in their personal learning journey, in their personal learning outcome, in their personal understanding of whatever the subject matter is. And there are technologies, there are AI being produced and developed that actually help and support these sort of assessments. And I think the world of assessment has to change radically to meet the needs and the challenges of society as we move out of COVID into this new paradigm that I'm describing.
Yeah, excellent. I wholeheartedly agree with that one. Definitely, thank you. There's I had a question myself, which actually somebody's put, sort of phrased it in a different way slightly as well. So I'll sort of merge the two together if I can do that coherently. So the OECD Education Policy Outlook report in 2019, obviously pre-COVID, talked about addressing inequalities of all levels of education system is needed to build quality education. I think that's not something that's a surprise to everybody, and I think that's something that that's probably something that's going to be a theme, unfortunately, for many years to come. But the bringing that together with the question that's put really is about the role of COVID in the increase in the digital divide, because I think one of the things that we have seen in some locations is that the inequalities of access to education because of COVID have increased because of access to connectivity and so on for remote learning. So how do you think we can move forward from that and actually use the lessons we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic to increase the equality and reduce the inequality of education?
Well, I mean, again, it's a huge question. There's no simple answer to it, but I think there is, or there are opportunities. If I can give you one example of the opportunity, I'm working with a public company, DevClever PLC, who have two products. One is called Launch My Career. Another one that I helped configure is something called ulearn.net, u-learn.net. And u-learn.net is split into three components. It's split into a deep philosophy and engagement in social and emotional learning in terms of building a profile that we can understand who the individual is, to profile them in a manner that we can, under GDPR compliance areas, understand their individual learning challenges and their own individual makeup, and then provide adaptive technology, immersive technology, to support them in their learning journey and to really bring a personal learning environment at scale. The second part of ulearn.net is targeted at the telco companies. And it's a really interesting, well, I think it's interesting philosophy. If you take, and I'm not going to mention names, but take a typical telco company, or one particular telco company, they have 350 million clients. If you think about the logic of that, they have 350 million telephone numbers. By default, that telephone number is a digital identity. So you can know or understand who that individual is in a secure manner because their phone number is their phone number, not anybody else's. Off the back of that, you can then build this profiling for that individual based on his secure environment. You can then configure content adaptively for that individual. And if you take the 350 million people within this ecosystem and assume many of them are parents and many of the parents will have children, even if you only captured 5%, 10% of that ecosystem, that's still 35 million people. And that is a huge cohort of engagement. When you look at these telco companies are not just providing content through the traditional telephone, smartphones invariably, but they're also providing education resources through television channels, through stream TV. So if you look at it holistically, whether it's a smartphone, whether it's even a legacy phone, you can provide resources through those environments, through televisions, through media generally, to engage in a different way that has been engaged previously. And the ability, if you look at the Netflix model, if you look at the streaming areas, you're able to get to an audience. We're not dictated now by purely the BBC or ITV. There are multiple channels to get to people, and there are secure ways of reaching them and protecting their data and providing them with a personal journey. Now, that is a huge challenge. I'm not going to say it's easy because there's a lot of work to be done, configuring content into the right models, understanding the cloud engagement, the uploads, downloads of data. There are a number of problems and challenges in doing this. But to come to the point, surely COVID is that transition point. Surely it is the tipping point where we understand where we do need to address these distributed networks, where we do need to be challenged by the fact that people live in remote environments. I mean, we're talking about the United Kingdom. Think about Africa. Think about parts of Asia Pac. Think about areas in Europe to a certain extent. So I think being the optimist, I think there are huge opportunities to address these channels, these distribution channels, but it has to be fundamentally with authentic content and through trusted distribution networks. And they're not necessarily the obvious ones to each and all of us today. So that needs to evolve and needs to be developed.
Thank you, Alan. That's really thought-provoking, and I think we all recognise the challenges that are ahead for us in education. But I think picking out the key principles that you've put together there, I think the idea of the personal wallet, where people are actually needing to take their data with them and access to that data, as you mentioned, both in terms of qualifications and formal things, but also in terms of the the behaviours, if you like, and the soft skills, and so
Exactly.
people have a record of that. I think that's a really big takeaway for me. So I really appreciate that. Just wait and see if there's any more questions. I think that there is one potentially, but we'll just see if that comes in. If not, we'll bring that to a conclusion. But thank you very much, Alan. I do appreciate your time. And just a reminder for everybody, just don't forget that the next talk will be by Peter Hamilton, who's the founder of the Spiral Partnership, on Thursday, the 9th of June. So please keep an eye out on the Imagine Education social networks for that one. And the recording for this session will become available in a few days' time from Imagine Education, and I also do believe through EDT partners. So if you want to go back on that, or if you missed out some of it, then please do take the time to have a look through. It's definitely well worth it. So I'd like to say thank you once again to you, Alan, and do appreciate your time and your input and your thoughts and your expertise. So thank you, Alan, and we'll now draw things to a conclusion. So once again, thank you very much.
Entirely my pleasure. Thank you.